The evolution of the iconic run-and-gun series Contra has proven to be quite the emotional roller coaster ride since its explosive debut in arcades in 1987, and undergoing all sorts of wild iterations and mutations leading all the way up to a brand new game in 2024. On a mission to delve beyond the more well-known and beloved entries of the franchise, I recently took on the challenge of completing every main game in the series and also exploring the numerous home computer and mobile versions. So in this two-part retrospective, we'll blast our way through over 30 Contra games and ports, with this first installment revisiting everything from the quarter-munching arcade original and up through the 16-bit masterworks on the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis. Let's review aggressively and check out every Contra game. It all started in the arcades with Konami's release of Contra in 1987 in Japan, North America, and Europe, with the European version being renamed to Gryzor in an attempt to disassociate the game with political events, such as the Iran-Contra scandal, occurring around the same time period. Settling nicely somewhere between Konami's previous hit action titles like Russian Attack and Gradius, players would get a now textbook example of the run-and-gun genre, mixing platforming with a heavy focus on shooting down hordes of enemies and dodging a hellscape of bullets, with special features including two-player simultaneous play, a vertically oriented screen, and occasional moments of pseudo-3D perspectives to mix up the gameplay. Despite the Contra title and its main characters being seemingly inspired by Nicaraguan revolutionaries, the game's thematic elements borrow much more heavily from the action blockbuster film Aliens, which had been released a year prior. Set in the distant future of 2633, the fate of the Earth is up to the two commandos Bill Reiser and Lance Bean as they head to the island of Galuga to destroy the base of the Red Falcon organization and the alien entity controlling them. Legally distinct aliens, of course. The H.R. Giger design inspirations are fairly blatant at times, and even the characters' names are amalgamations of actors from Aliens. Regardless of originality, it makes for a great setting to frame the adrenaline-pumping gameplay presented here. At its core basics, you control the game with an 8-way joystick and 2 buttons dedicated to shooting and the iconic somersault jumping. You're able to aim and shoot in multiple directions, even while in the air, and can also lie prone on the ground for additional evasive maneuvers. And you'll definitely need to learn how to avoid getting hit, as you'll die instantly from any contact with an enemy or their projectiles, setting the standard for a high level of difficulty that the franchise would become notorious for. On the weaponry side of things, you start with a basic gun that can be upgraded with pickups into either a machine gun, laser, spread shot, or fireball, along with rapid-fire upgrades or temporary invincibility items. And sadly, any collected weapons will be lost when you die. The first stage is a side-scroller set up in a typical run-and-gun format, but after you bust through the defensive wall at the end of the level, the game switches up the perspective into the third dimension with a view behind the player, shooting your way up through various hallways of the enemy base, destroying generators to progress through corridors, while a ticking countdown timer keeps you blasting briskly through every room. You do lose the ability to aim here, and can only shoot straight forward, but can still jump and go prone on the ground for dodging bullets or blowing up things at different heights. Eventually you'll face off with a boss in the standard perspective again, and then make your way to the waterfall stage. This level finally makes a good use case of the vertical screen orientation as you climb upwards instead of traversing to the right, a gameplay mechanic that would eventually gain some infamy as you could easily kill the other player playing with you if they can't keep up the pace and fall off the bottom of the screen. After making your way up top and through another well-defended fortification, you go through another set of 3D hallways similar to the second stage, but with the difficulty ramping up, of course. Now, the final stage goes back to a side-scrolling view, but also presents a seamless journey through multiple environments and bosses, traveling through snowfields, the energy zone, the spike-laden hangar, and ultimately the alien's lair, seeing you dramatically blast your way through a giant grotesque alien mouth, traversing through its guts, and finally destroying its pulsating heart. Being someone more familiar with the segmented stages of the NES version, and then finally playing this one, I was definitely taken aback by how well the stages blurred together and provided a thrilling ride of non-stop excitement to its finish. And finishing this one is no cakewalk. While I went for a 1-credit clear in my own challenge I'm undertaking, it's worth noting that the game doesn't allow you to keep feeding quarters into it in order to brute force your way to the end, and has a limit of 3 continues before requiring you to start over from the beginning. This might feel pretty mean at first, but it's a fairly short game once you start to learn and memorize everything, and in general the game feels quite fair, on normal difficulty anyway. The control is very responsive and consistent, and while your character doesn't move super quickly, everything around you is appropriately designed to accommodate for it. And if you can manage to hang on to the supremely powerful spread shot, you'll surely be able to overpower those Red Falcon hordes with maniacal glee. And while this original version might look and feel a little weird to most folks that may be used to the NES game, fans of the series should really give this one a shot and see where it all began. In case you're wondering on which region's version to check out, gameplay-wise they're all virtually identical, with the exception of the European Gryzor having 2-player alternating play instead of 2-player simultaneous play. But overall, Contra was very well received and rather successful in arcades, and would quickly start to spawn all sorts of home conversions, which we'll dig into now. And here's the one many of you are probably waiting for. Didn't think you could get off easy and dip right into the beloved NES version, did you? Oh no, first off, we'll be diving into some of the ports released on home computer platforms. First looking at a trio of conversions licensed by Konami, but developed by Ocean Software. The Amstrad CPC, a fairly successful line of home computers in Europe in the 80s, would be the first to receive a port of Gryzor, as it was initially titled in the region, and was honestly an admirable attempt at bringing the experience home with pretty severe technical limitations. The sprite work here is actually pretty juicy and colorful looking, although you'll notice that you have individual static screens to run through as opposed to continuous scrolling. There are also some limitations in the sound department, as you have to choose between either music or sound effects during play of the 128K version, as you can't have both at the same time, and the 64K version has sound effects only. 2-player simultaneous mode is also not available, and you'll need to take turns. Controlling the game is where things get strange. Up is jump, down is used to drop down to lower ledges, but you can still aim in various directions and go prone as long as you are shooting. It's a little awkward if you're used to the typical controls. It makes the game pretty challenging. Otherwise, this port makes clear efforts to include as much game content as they could from the original, with a few stages restructured a bit, but no snowfield or armored trooper mini-boss. And the fireball gun also didn't make the cut. I gotta mention the pretty hilarious ending though. Once you blow up Emperor Demon Evil Heart Gamera Moss King, you get this lovely screen letting you know that despite your efforts, the Earth blows up anyway. How sad. And finally, another very notable thing to bring up regarding this version is the origination of Bob Wakeland's now iconic artwork that was created for this and the other Ocean ports, taking clear inspiration from not only Aliens, but also the recently released Predator film, borrowing 2 poses of Arnold for Bill and Lance here, and Lance would get a little Rambo injection with the haircut and headband. Gryzor would also make its way onto another popular European computer, the ZX Spectrum, facing even more technical limitations this time around. Obviously, the color palette is very limited here, but this version does have actual screen scrolling, along with the benefit of simultaneous sound and music. Control-wise, the main funkiness here is probably the inability to move left on some of the side-scrolling stages, despite being able to on the 3D bases and waterfall stage. Guns also behave a little differently. The machine gun, fireball, or spread shot are obtained by simply shooting the containers for them in the first stage, and you're actually stuck with that weapon for the rest of the game, even if you die. And there's no laser and no barrier power-up, which is a bummer because this one is rather challenging, further compounded by bullets being pretty difficult to see sometimes. But much like the Amstrad version, it does make a valiant effort to include as much content as possible from the arcade original. And in perhaps the most bewildering version here, we've got the Commodore 64 port, released both in Europe and North America in 1988. The art looks a bit low effort, and unlike any of the other versions so far, while everything moves along pretty smoothly, the speed of the game doesn't line up well with the abysmally slow rate of gunfire that you can output. To make the difficulty exponentially worse are the controls, as you must use a joystick for moving and shooting, but have to jump using the keyboard spacebar. Now, while you could potentially remap this sort of thing if you're using an emulator, I attempted the authentic control scheme and eventually ended up putting my keyboard on the floor so that I could use my foot to stomp on the spacebar. It was a fun novelty for a few minutes, but ultimately a frustrating gaming experience. On the content side of things, the fireball gun is missing, but this does manage to include every level and boss from the arcade version, so at least that's something positive. It's too bad we never ended up getting an Amiga port of Contra, which was in development for some time, and even had some screenshots shown on the back of the box for the Commodore 64 and DOS versions, and was also mentioned in various magazines, but was ultimately canceled. And speaking of the DOS version, here we go with likely the most unfortunate abomination of the bunch. This time brought to us by Banana Development. And yeah, let's just bask in the CGA glory right here. At least the screen scrolls, kinda, but obviously it's extremely choppy. And this conversion was apparently designed specifically for a processor running at 4.77 MHz and ended up playing way too fast on anything else. If you try this out on DOSBox, you'll want to drop the cycles down to make this somewhat playable. And the problems run deeper with the control scheme, utilizing the numpad to move around, but requiring the center key to be pressed in order to actually stop running. And as the game lags out, your inputs will also suffer the consequences. This can be alleviated somewhat with a gamepad or joystick, but the game is still pretty brutal to try and get through. And audio is limited to PC speaker bleeps and buzzes, a fitting soundtrack for melting your eyeballs with these graphics. Now CGA can look okay in some instances, but I'm not convinced that this is one of them. Some positives though, 2-player simultaneous mode is a thing, and the game is also fairly faithful, with including all of the levels in some form, and along with the bosses. But otherwise, consider this one simply a morbid curiosity. And the version perhaps most familiar to everyone, it's finally time to look at the Famicom and NES port, released in Japan and North America in 1988, and also eventually for PAL regions in 1990 under the name Probotector. Now rather than crank out a scaled-down version of the arcade experience, Konami would give Contra a complete overhaul by ditching the vertical screen aspect ratio, providing tighter controls, improving the sound quality and music, and lengthening the stages with all new structures. The end result was a smash hit for the console that quickly became one of the most successful action games of the era and still very fondly remembered today. I can still remember my dad buying this game for me one random afternoon while at a local drugstore that usually had an assortment of NES games for sale, and I didn't really know what I was in for at the time, but it wasn't long before it became one of my favorite games despite its punishing challenge. And gotta give a shout out to the Konami code for the 30 lives needed to actually make some progress and eventually beat the game, and little did I know that someday I could get through this without power-ups and without dying. Now getting back into some of the differences from the arcade original, the first and probably best upgrade is the responsive control, which feels much snappier and more precise, and ultimately making the game feel very fair despite the constant onslaught of enemies and bullets coming at you. The weapon power-ups are all intact, although here we would get the classic Falcon symbols for every drop. All of the levels from the arcade version are also here, but with some modifications. The base levels no longer have a timer or required hallway turns, and some of the bosses are slightly altered, like this super rad looking new boss of the waterfall stage, and the latter half of the game has been split up into extended stages of each of the unique areas: the snowfield, energy zone, hangar, and alien lair. While the seamless level transitions of the arcade version are missed a bit here, this compromise does at least add more content and length to the game. Aesthetically, Contra was translated to the 8-bit console extremely well, with vibrant colors and detailed pixel art, and those Giga-inspired monster designs still looking fantastic. The game also performs extremely well with minimal lag and sprite flickering that rarely affects the gameplay. Music and sound effects are also top-notch, bringing us some of the most memorable music on the NES and cementing Konami's prowess in quality sound design for the time period. The Japanese version would also have a leg up in the graphics department, as Konami was able to utilize a special chip for the Famicom cartridge, allowing for animated backgrounds, animated cutscenes, and also a level map screen in between stages. While these extras may make the Famicom version the definitive one to play here, luckily the other versions still essentially play the same, but with some minor tweaks. Weirdly, the game's plot was modified slightly for the North American version, placing it in the Amazon jungle in present-day 1987, and changing the codenames to Mad Dog and Scorpion for our blue pants and red pants dudes. The PAL version would see a more drastic facelift with being renamed Probotector, replacing the playable characters and most of the enemies with robots instead of humans. Otherwise, the gameplay is nearly identical to the North American version. The sprite swaps were made to work around laws in Germany at the time regarding violence in video games. It's also worth mentioning the North American and PAL versions start off with slightly reduced difficulty, and starting the second loop of the game is the same level of challenge that the Famicom kicks off with. But from there, you can continue to scale up the difficulty with each consecutive cleared loop of the game if you're up for it. And while the game's reputation of NES hard can be a bit divisive for some, for me it's one of my favorite elements of this game, and keeps me playing it repeatedly over the years. First-time players will surely struggle a bit, but it does keep things fairly reasonable by not making you restart after losing a life, granting 3 continues, and of course allowing for the legendary Konami code giving you 30 lives per player. So once you start memorizing all the stage hazards and enemy behaviors, you'll be well on your way to blowing the face off of Red Falcon, getting up in those alien guts, and exploding the pulsating heart within. A truly satisfying conclusion to an 8-bit masterpiece where you can consider yourself a hero. And one more Contra port to cover here is a pretty unique version for the Japanese home computer MSX2, released in 1989 and developed and published by Konami. It seems to bear a bit more similarity to the NES version compared to the arcade, but features all new levels and artwork, and a switchback to the single-screen setup we saw before in the old Amstrad port. Despite that limitation, the game feel is pretty solid, although undoubtedly a far less challenging experience, especially considering the addition of a life bar and a generous amount of lives that can be acquired during the playthrough. Getting through this port also might take you a bit longer than other versions, clocking in at a total of 19 levels, albeit a few of them are more like short boss fights, and some stages are often feeling rather recycled. Power-ups are also handled a little differently, with weapon pickups triggering a menu to select your gun from, along with Falcon items that incrementally upgrade your movement speed and bullet strength. All in all, it's a pretty neat alternative version of this game that's definitely worth a look if you're a curious Contra fan, but ultimately may be a bit repetitive and disappointing in the challenge department. And finally, the clear paramount at the top of this Contra heap is the LCD handheld from 1989. I kid, but honestly, this is kind of fun for what it is. Multiple angled lanes of alien blasting and bullet dodging await in one of Konami's forays into liquid crystal display games. And it is at least notable for being the first portable version of Contra, even predating the first Game Boy title. And it's a pretty cool looking collector's piece. Beyond that, excluding the copious amounts of straight re-releases and compilation appearances of the arcade and NES versions, the only other unique iterations of Contra we haven't covered yet would be some of the mobile ports for cell phones released many years later, which I will save for part 2 in this video series. I'm sure you can't wait. But it's finally time to move on to the first sequel, Super Contra.
What is this place? Keep your eyes peeled.
So Contra would get its first sequel in early 1988 with the arcade release of Super Contra. Bill and Lance would return in another run-and-gun adventure 1 year after the events of the first game, again facing off with Red Falcon, who has commandeered a military installation. At first glance, it doesn't feel too far removed from the original Contra and retains the same vertical screen setup, but there are a few considerable changes the further you delve in. On the control side, the main thing to point out right away is the addition of a high jump, executed by holding up while jumping, a maneuver often unknown to new players, but absolutely essential to survival. Your weaponry also has evolved a bit, with 4 different guns, including the spread shot, rapid-fire missiles, a laser, and grenade launcher, some of which are upgradable to a second and more powerful version. The Falcon logos are not present here though, so you'll need to remember what your favorite or least favorite gun looks like. The side-scrolling sections will feel pretty familiar, but with some fancy inclined planes added in. And interestingly, you won't find a single death pit to fall into, putting a stronger focus on running and gunning over platforming. The general intensity has been ramped up with a lot more enemies running around and more projectiles to avoid, and multiple memorable boss battle set pieces. The second stage introduces a top-down perspective. No more pseudo 3D stuff this time around. There's not much innovation happening here compared to other top-down shooters of the time, but you do at least get a new power-up here with a screen-wiping bomb that you can collect and use when desired. The game has 5 levels total, with themes you can expect at this point: military outposts, a jungle full of deadly foreground layers blocking your view, and of course some pulsating alien guts corridors. The look and sound of everything isn't too far off from the original, maybe a bit grittier and washed out looking in parts, but overall I'd say slightly improved in the graphics and sound department. And while it's a shorter experience than the first game, I considered the level of challenge to be exponentially higher this time around, and again your number of continues will be limited to 3 on the default dip switch settings. Personally, I had to put in a lot more hours in this to get a 1cc compared to the first game. And while this harshness can be off-putting to many, in the end I found it to be a lot more intense and highly satisfying, and absolutely worth a playthrough for any hardcore Contra fans out there. Super Contra would also get a couple of North American exclusive computer ports in 1990, including this DOS conversion developed by a distinctive software and renamed Super C, like the other versions to follow. While some might immediately cringe at the sight of this, it was certainly a step up from the other Contra game for DOS, and a solid effort of capturing the spirit of the arcade game. The level designs and boss fights follow along pretty closely for the most part, and the controls are mostly faithful, even down to the high jump and intermediate angles on your bullets, and it supports 2-player simultaneous play. The absurd level of challenge also compounds a bit, thanks to extremely fast enemies and a few completely broken moments where you might just die for no reason. To amend for this, you at least start with 10 lives, and you gain 10 more each time you clear a stage. So assuming you're able to hook up a gamepad or joystick here, I'd say you have a fighting chance. The keyboard users, good luck. In the end, I honestly had a fun time beating this one, even if it was kind of on accident with 1 life left. The same developers, under an alternate name Unlimited Software, would also release an Amiga version, although oddly it only got a North American release. It generally looks and feels similar to the DOS version, with some slightly better graphics and sound quality. Unfortunately, things go south once you start to battle with the controls. Not unlike the Amstrad CPC port we covered earlier, you are limited to 1 button for shooting, and jumping is handled by pressing up, causing all sorts of complications in aiming and also getting rid of the high jump ability. Intermediate bullet angles are also removed, and you are locked into 8-way directional shots. Unfortunately, this really makes the game generally unwieldy and frustrating, and damn near impossible to make progress without some serious patience for jank. But once again, Konami would bring us a superbly crafted version of Super C for the Famicom and NES, with a similar approach to its predecessor in how they evolved the source material to create an absolute beast of a game. The feel is essentially identical to Contra 1, ignoring the arcade's high jump and instead sticking with the same controls you're probably used to. The power-up system also retains the various Falcon symbols, with no upgrades per weapon other than the rapid-fire R. Focus groups must have demanded a better F-gun, so this time around you get a big splashy fireball attack that can also be charged up to unleash even more damage, and finally gives the spread shot a run for its money as being the OP weapon of choice. The spread shot even got nerfed a little bit by inflicting half as much damage to the bosses. Super C is also a bit longer than the arcade version, interspersing the existing level framework with all new unique areas and boss battles, including an expanded alien lair and mutated monstrosity to face off with at the conclusion. The 2 top-down stages are still there, and platforming is not completely thrown out the window like the arcade original, with plenty of death pits and other hazardous and dramatic-looking moments to progress through. Challenge-wise, it still has that firm but fair feeling, although it does seem to be a bit more troll-filled with lots of spawning goons and more random projectiles in the mix. It's certainly feeling more reasonable than the brutality of the arcade version, though. And as far as different regions' releases go, there's nothing too drastic this time around. The Japanese version includes a cheat code for 30 lives and a level select, while the US code only gives you 10 lives. And once again, the PAL version would be sprite swapped with robots and receive the title Probotector 2: Return of the Evil Forces. All in all, it's an incredible follow-up. Arguably better than the original in some aspects, but maybe ultimately down to personal preference as to which of the 2 NES games might be your favorite. Going under the radar for a little bit here, I also wanted to point out a few other alternative means of getting your Contra fix, as there were a healthy handful of bootlegs released to wean off the success of the series. While some pirate carts you might come across were basically straight-up copies, a few included totally redesigned stages like Super Contra 2, or sometimes even using a different game engine, like this surprisingly fun jankster piece, Super Contra 7, and this fairly ambitious demake of Contra Spirits, which honestly wins the award for best ending screen in the series. On the fan-made side, there are also a wide array of ROM hacks that have been made for both the original Contra and Super C, either with small modifications and improvements, translations, or completely overhauled level design. Revenge of the Red Falcon might be one of the highlights here, bordering on Kaizo levels of difficulty, but still very playable. Or Deadpool fans might want to check out Deadpool Special Mission, released fairly recently at the end of 2023. And one last unlicensed oddity is the TRS-80 color computer conversion titled The Contras, based on the first NES title, and apparently only being available for purchase via mail order and having a very limited print run. It retains a fairly authentic look and feel, but with some modifications to levels, enemy behaviors, and controls. It still seems to be pretty buggy in the end. It's cool that this even exists, though. I also should mention Konami's YY World games, 2 lighthearted Famicom exclusives that feature a wide array of characters and references from the company's body of work. YY World 2 even includes Bill as a very kawaii playable character, and a recreation of the jungle stage from Contra 1. So other than that glorious LCD handheld we were looking at earlier, the Contra series would get its first portable release in 1991 for the Nintendo Game Boy, simply titled Contra in Japan, and renamed to Operation C in North America. European regions would also get their own robotic version named Probotector in 1992. And while it certainly has very recognizable elements and music from previous Contra games, Operation C has all new levels of its own and a few other things to set it apart as its own unique experience that actually succeeds very well on the small screen. You control Scorpion in a battle against Black Viper this time around, in the North American version anyway, and you're on a mission to destroy an alien embryo thing being kept and incubated for nefarious purposes. You've got 5 levels total, 3 of them the usual side-scrolling fare, and 2 top-down stages as well, not unlike what we got in Super C, and of course including a variety of mini-bosses and stage bosses to face off with. In the guns department, you have the standard but actually very effective machine gun, the return of the fireball, and an upgrade-capable spread shot, and also the first appearance of a homing weapon that automatically seeks out the nearest enemy. The wrists of Game Boy users could also get some relief here, with fully automatic rapid fire for all weapons instead of resorting to button mashing. Also on the play control end of things, your movement has been slowed down here to accommodate the smaller screen size, and you might need a bit of an adjustment period to get used to the jumping height and physics. Overall, it's undoubtedly Contra, and it looks, sounds, and plays great, even if it doesn't really bring anything substantially new and innovative to the table after the previous entries in the series. But at this early stage in the handheld gaming era, just being able to play Contra in the backseat of the car on a road trip was innovation enough. And I must say, playing this game on an actual TV screen with a Super Game Boy accessory is definitely a pleasure. And it's a nice bite-sized run-and-gun experience with a more reasonable and casual-friendly difficulty curve as well. Some minor complaints might be a lack of 2-player mode, and some harder difficulty modes could have been cool. And of course, more levels and content is always welcomed. But regardless, I still have a blast with this one every time I pick it up. Contra would see one of its most dramatic and explosive evolutions yet in the first 16-bit iteration of the series with Contra 3: The Alien Wars for the Super Nintendo, aka Contra Spirits for the Super Famicom, and Super Probotector Alien Rebels for PAL regions, all released in 1992. The story drops us into the year 2636, where Red Falcon has laid waste to Neo City and the alien wars have begun. Bill and Lance return in the Japanese version, but for North America, Konami have seemingly killed off Mad Dog and Scorpion, with their descendants Jimbo and Sully taking over for some reason. The regional differences in plot continue to muddy the waters, but regardless, we are immediately dropped into a hyper-kinetic, action-packed, post-apocalyptic environment chock full of dramatic chaos and memorable action, with Nobuya Nakazato at the helm of directing the project, a name we'd see in the credits of many future Contra titles and other Konami classics. He took the series into a more cinematic direction that really pushed the limits of the new hardware. Rather than the typical level structure of previous entries of the series, he aimed for something new and crazy to happen every 3 screen scrolls, further pushing the wide variety of gameplay experiences and crafting an absolutely wild ride full of over-the-top B-movie style action schlock moments, from battling giant turtle beasts to motorcycle chases to clinging to freaking missiles while blowing up a massive spacecraft. There are 6 levels total, including 2 top-down stages that make heavy use of the Mode 7 features of the SNES that allow you to rotate the screen as you navigate a large area to destroy various capsules to progress forward. These sections are generally not as well liked as the usual side view stages, but they break up the action nicely and are quite impressive from a technical standpoint. Aside from the advancements in level design, some new gameplay mechanics would also be introduced. Each player can now carry 2 different weapon types at a time and switch between them at will, even being able to fire them both at once with a rarely useful somersault attack, or by rapidly switching between the two while firing, it allows you to unleash double the amount of projectiles than usual. Automatic rapid fire is also in use for everything, and weaponry includes some returning favorites like the classic machine gun, an improved and powerful laser, a homing shot, and the good old spread shot is back as well, although definitely nerfed on the damage output. The F-gun is now a straight-up flamethrower that proves extremely useful in specific moments, and the new MVP of the bunch might have to be the Crusher missiles, with a somewhat shorter range but extremely powerful and explosive. To top it off, you can also pick up and stockpile screen-wiping bombs to clear things up when it gets too overwhelming. Your maneuvers would also get a nice addition with the ability to lock your stance while aiming, along with being able to cling to many walls and ceiling surfaces. And overall, it's a true pleasure to control. It's super responsive and very smooth. On the options side of things, 2-player simultaneous play works great, although the top-down stages can get a little weird with the choice to either share one screen or split the screen, either one making those stages a little more challenging without very deliberate teamwork. We'd also get 3 difficulty settings, with hard mode being the only way to see the true ending and an exclusive final boss form. You also get to increase your starting lives up to 7 if you want, or the Japanese version also has a 30 live code. One thing's for sure, the Contra level of challenge is in full force here, especially once you ramp things up to hard mode. Top that off with its top-notch new aesthetic, a pulse-pounding soundtrack, and expertly crafted action set pieces, and Konami truly dropped a run-and-gun masterpiece on us with this one. A title still highly regarded to this day as a prime example of the genre, and certainly one of the best games on the Super Nintendo, period. Contra 3 would also get a conversion for the Game Boy in 1994 with Contra: The Alien Wars, attempting to fit the experience onto a portable platform. Konami outsourced development to Factor 5 on this one, a studio somewhat well known for its work on the Turrican series, another similar run-and-gun franchise of the era. And they certainly made a commendable effort here to cram as much action-packed content as they could into a tiny package. Some things are obviously missing, of course. You can't have more than one gun, it is single player only, the top-down stages cannot be rotated, the motorcycle and missile riding sections are gone, and many bosses are either removed or modified heavily. And it's naturally much slower and clunky than its 16-bit predecessor, giving the gameplay a bit more of a methodical and calculated feel to it. There are plenty of difficulty options and a password feature, and even a Maniac mode that only gives you 2 lives to complete the entire game. It also has some Super Game Boy enhancements, with basic color palettes and additional sound effects that utilize the Super Nintendo hardware on occasion. All in all, this is a very solid handheld port that is certainly of interest for Contra fans. And we'll branch out of the release timeline briefly here with a blast forward into 2002, when Contra 3 would get repurposed once more for the Game Boy Advance with Contra Advance: The Alien Wars EX, developed by Tosei. And rather than just dump the Super Nintendo ROM onto a cart, the game would end up being reworked considerably into another smaller screened iteration with a handful of somewhat considerable drawbacks. Removed features include the ability to carry 2 guns, along with the screen-clearing bombs. And the Mode 7-tastic top-down levels are also missing and have been swapped out with reworked sections from the Genesis Contra game, Contra Hardcore. And in general, the gameplay area is really compacted, leading to somewhat larger hitboxes on your character, along with larger bullets, and some of the hazards becoming increasingly difficult to avoid. Pair that with a lot of slightly modified enemy and boss behaviors, and veterans of the originals might have a tough time reconfiguring their muscle memory to survive the new patterns. It does have 2 difficulty modes, Novice and Normal, which play similarly other than the number of lives and continues available. And the Novice mode also cuts the content short at a point and encourages increasing the difficulty in order to see the remainder of the game. There's also a password feature, which oddly will give you passwords that don't work sometimes. Fortunately, there's still a 2-player link-up feature, although honestly, I would imagine that to get super chaotic with the reduced real estate. One actually helpful addition I should bring up is the ability to lock your aim while you're running, which definitely comes in handy sometimes and helps balance out the increased difficulty from the weird feeling this whole experience gives off. Overall, this version is certainly playable, but in many ways feels like a hamstrung hodgepodge of 2 extremely good games, as opposed to a unique compilation. Its release also probably disappointed some at the time, with oddly timed marketing around the same time as Shattered Soldier was coming out on the PlayStation 2, making it seem a bit like a handheld port of that game as opposed to recycling the 16-bit classics. Of course, it's still based on extremely good games, so you could do much worse. But the main reason to play Contra Advance these days is if you're very curious to see what differences pop up in the gameplay. Now let's head back to 1992 with one of the weirdest outliers of the bunch here, Contra Force, released exclusively in North America for the NES several months after Contra 3 had already dropped onto the Super Nintendo. Originally developed in 1991 with the working title of Arkhound, the Japanese release of the game was cancelled, but eventually rebranded and repurposed for this game, which kinda looks and smells like a Contra, but it veers off into some really different directions, and it's all in slow motion. But let's dig into the content here a little bit before tackling the obvious performance issues plaguing this one. Set in the current time of 1992, a terrorist group named DNME has taken over Neo City and captured its chief commissioner, and it's up to 4 random dudes from C-Force to save the day. Bill and Lance are nowhere to be found here, nor are any Red Falcon or even aliens for that matter. But instead we've got Burns, Smith, Iron, and Beans, which notably marks the first time in a Contra game you'd be able to pick from multiple characters that each have some different traits and weapon loadouts. You can pause and switch them out at any time, each with their own stock of lives, and you can even call in one of your comrades for help at any time with various AI-driven strategies, and they'll appear in-game to assist you for 5 seconds. As mentioned, each character plays a little differently with different jump heights and weapon loadouts, which can be upgraded Gradius style as you pick up various suitcase drops throughout the stages, often hidden in the copious amounts of destructible walls and objects. There's another weird difference from Contra here in terms of controls, where you can no longer shoot diagonally downwards while running, and instead have to jump a bit awkwardly to get that shot angle. At least your jump height can also be variable depending on how long you hold the button down. Other game features include 2-player simultaneous play, 5 levels including 2 top-down perspective stages, boss fights that sometimes have extraordinary amounts of health, the aforementioned destructible environments, and an overall experience absolutely drenched in slowdown. Now, slowdown in NES games isn't anything new, but here it's another level of sludginess, as even just a single enemy on the screen can start causing performance issues. One has to wonder if this is why the original release of Arkhound was cancelled, and it's honestly a bit baffling that Konami thought it would be fine to slap the Contra brand onto something with such a glaringly obvious problem. It's still somewhat playable if you're very patient, especially through some of the janky platforming sections, but it's a painful flaw that can't be ignored. It's a shame, since this had some pretty cool ideas for its time, topped off with some really solid graphics and a banger soundtrack to boot. And it really could have been a sleeper hit if the game ran properly and it wasn't burdened with the expectations of the Contra logo on the box. And those going into this expecting an improvement on Super C or something, they'll be sorely disappointed. Sadly, not even a ROM hack seems to be able to fix this game, although supposedly there may be some slight improvement available if you're willing to tinker around with overclocking emulators. I will mention that very recently in 2024, a fan-made Contra Force remake has been released for PC, appearing to be more of a complete overhaul and reimagining, utilizing assets from several different classic Contra games. Now, I haven't tried this one myself, but I might have to check this one out someday. And finally, we have arrived at what is likely the most outrageous franchise entry we'll be covering in this video, Contra Hardcore, released exclusively for the Mega Drive and Sega Genesis in 1994. Taking place 5 years after the Alien Wars, this dilapidated and crime-infested planet instigates the formation of the Hardcore, a squad of 4 elite soldiers who must quickly take on the task of responding to the compromise of the city's defense system, and the mission continues to escalate from there. You can pick from Ray, Sheena, Fang, or Brownie, each with their own unique playstyle and set of weaponry available. And all characters would also get a super useful new sliding ability. Ray and Sheena play more like what you might have been used to in Contra 3, but Fang brings the attitude with some powerful charge-up shots and straight-up punching attacks. And our little robo-buddy Brownie enjoys the benefits of being short, along with a jetpack and hover ability, and not to mention a completely OP yo-yo thing that wreaks absolute havoc on bosses. The possibilities expand even further as the game introduces branching level design as you progress through stages and make important decisions that lead to a variety of plot pathways and multiple endings in one of the most story-centric experiences yet in the series. But make no mistake, high-octane action is still the top priority here. All of the levels go with the side view, unless you count some very technically impressive 3D-esque background effects. And not unlike Contra 3, the gameplay evolves in a very fast-paced and dynamic fashion. You'll also notice an increase in the amount of boss encounters, giving some sections of the game more of a boss rush feel, and results in a non-stop assault of hyper-creative chaos. Astute run-and-gunners might notice some design similarities to later Treasure-developed games, such as Gunstar Heroes and Alien Soldier, which shared some of the same designers. Aesthetically, it still feels very Contra, but it almost takes it to a more cartoony and comic book look, with a nice mix of goofy and grotesque monster designs, all supplemented by an absolutely banging techno-funk-fueled soundtrack that might be one of the best of its kind on the console. Everything is just so over-the-top and insane, and in the best way possible. Admittedly, the challenge level has proven to be over the top for some. While it lacks difficulty options, there are some regional differences if you're looking for different experiences in this regard. The Japanese version might be the most gentle introduction, giving you 3 health per life and unlimited continues, while the US version sticks to the good old 1-hit death and 5 continues. The PAL Probotector release also has 1-hit death, but drops you to 4 continues. And there's also a ROM hack floating around that restores the 3 health per life, but you still get English text for all of the dialogue and cutscenes. And like most Contra titles, the game controls and plays in a tough but fair way once you get in enough practice. Top that off with the character differences, varied level paths, and even a secret ending, there's truly no shortage of replayability here, making this a very addictive game to explore and master, and undoubtedly one of the best and most memorable games in the Contra series. And that wraps it up for part 1. In the next video, we'll be digging into the remainder of the franchise, starting with the stumble into an awkward transition to 3D on the PlayStation 1, and then riding that volatile wave of quality all the way to the newest game in the series, 2024's Operation Galuga. I should also mention that many of the games covered today have been re-released in an astounding variety of ways if you're looking to give them a try. But probably the most recent and generally well-assembled compilation available might be the Contra Anniversary Collection, which includes 7 of the more beloved games and a few extra regional variations, and is available on PC and other modern console platforms. And if you're curious to see some of my 1cc and deathless clears of some of these games, I've been uploading them to a second channel that I'll link in the description. Thanks so much for watching, and I'd love to hear some of your favorite Contra memories in the comments. We'll catch you next time. Our deep dive into every single Contra game ever made continues, as we explore further into the franchise's wild and sometimes perplexing evolution. In this video, we'll cover everything in the series starting from its questionable 3D phase in the late 90s, all the way up to the recently released Operation Galuga, running and gunning through all of the sensational returns to glory and some dubious detours along the way. Let's review aggressively once again and check out every Contra game. Our journey begins today with Contra's first appearance in true three-dimensional space. Legacy of War was released in North America in 1996 on the PS1 and in Europe in 1997, and also received a North American port to the Sega Saturn in that same year. Rather than develop in-house like Konami had with their previous titles, they outsourced development to Appaloosa Interactive, a studio formerly known as Novotrade, who are probably most well known for the Echo the Dolphin series. This would also be their first game on the PlayStation, and the transition from the 2D masterpieces on 16-bit hardware resulted in a rather awkward misstep for the series overall, but still morbidly fascinating in many ways. The game's story is set up as a retelling of Contra Hardcore, but with a somewhat revised timeline. The main villain here is Colonel Bassad, who has stolen an alien cell with intent for world domination, of course, and it's up to the Hardcore to stop him. Ray from the Genesis game has been included, but the other 3 new characters are Tasha, CD288, and Bubba, all with their own weapon loadouts and some small differences in speed and jumping abilities. At its heart, Legacy of War is still definitely fitting into the usual run-and-gun framework, but transferred into a 3D isometric view with a dynamic and often frustrating camera that you're unable to control directly. Auto-fire is an effect for shooting, and you can acquire additional guns in a similar fashion to Contra Hardcore with a different set of weapons available depending on your character. The hidden item cache concept from Contra Force comes back into play here, as you may need to search for destructible walls to find power-ups, barriers, and much-needed extra lives. You can also toggle into strafe mode and lock your position with trigger buttons. And of course jump, although sadly the classic somersault is missing in action here. I should also mention jumping is usually required to hit enemies at higher elevations, as you cannot aim upwards or downwards without the aid of a homing weapon. One-hit kills are sort of in play here, although there's actually not any sort of death animation when you get hit, making your life counter almost feel like a health bar. There are 3 difficulty modes, with easy mode letting you keep weapons after dying, and also cutting the game a bit short at a certain point and telling you to play like a man in order to see through all 7 stages and experience the true ending. Normal and hard modes decrease the life count and honestly provide one of the most challenging experiences in the entire series, especially if you refuse to save scum on the memory card, a feature that lets you save your progress and reload in case you don't want to waste a continue. While I do appreciate a good challenge, this game is often hard due to frustrating shortcomings of the design. The camera is really zoomed in and very erratic, and coupled with fast-moving enemy spawns that often appear very close to you and shoot you before you have much time to react. The controls are also a bit temperamental, with some inconsistencies in getting the strafe to toggle properly, and some very janky platforming moments with rough representations of depth perception. It's a shame that dual analog controls did not exist yet for the PS1 at that point in time, as surely this game would have greatly benefited from twin-stick shooting. But if you know me, I have quite a lot of patience for some jank, so despite all of these complaints, there are still a few interesting and commendable things going on in this rather ambitious game, and surely the developers had to have been under a lot of stress and pressure handling such an experimental moment in the franchise.
Your feeble skills are no match for me.
The action still moves along at a brisk pace, keeping things varied and interesting, with all sorts of bosses that you might recognize from previous games, and even vehicular moments like the rafting and motorboat sections. There's some silliness as well, like this jungle arcade with little mini arcade games that you can take a break with. So kind of the enemies to calmly wait outside for you to finish up a game of Pack Tank. On the presentation side, the game looks a bit messy with its combination of low poly models, muddy textures, and some sprite-based objects. But overall, it's pretty okay considering that era of 3D gaming. And if you're wanting a more migraine-inducing experience, early copies of the game included those good old red and blue 3D glasses for a pretty awful-looking 3D mode. Music is solid, with some classic Contra themes returning and finding its way onto CD-based audio for the first time, although sometimes it feels weirdly out of sync with a general lack of music changes during boss fights. I should also mention the Saturn port at this point, which plays generally the same as the PS1 version and has the same content, but it does have some very slight graphical differences. I can't really recommend one version over the other here, so just pick whichever is more accessible to you if you want to check this out. I know I may be complaining a lot about this one, but honestly, at times I was genuinely having a bit of fun playing this, but mostly when on easy mode, or when dipping into the variety of cheat codes available. Even after being able to 1cc most of the previous entries of the series in my quest to beat every Contra game, clearing normal mode on this game ended up feeling unreachable for me without using the memory card features, and I shudder to think of even trying hard mode again. I'm not saying it's impossible, but at a point I knew I should cut my losses and move on. Overall though, it's ultimately a disappointment and a harsh drop in quality compared to the amazing Contra Hardcore which just came out a couple years prior. And despite their missteps on Legacy of War, Appaloosa would be tasked again with another Contra follow-up on the PS1 with C: The Contra Adventure, released exclusively in North America in 1998. And no, based on the title, it's not a point-and-click RPG Zelda-like thing, although it's notable that this ended up being a single-player only game. Continuing directly from the events of Legacy of War, the surviving alien antagonist crash lands in South America and takes over a Mayan temple. Our cyborg friend Tasha investigates the situation, but contact is lost, so now it's up to Ray to chew bubblegum and kick some alien ass. And you might be thinking we have a return to 2D glory upon loading up the first level, but the bait and switch feeling is strong here, as level 2 drops you right back into the wild and weird world of 3D, albeit this time with a typically free-form and adjustable camera, giving off some Tomb Raider-esque vibes, but still retaining a focus on fast-paced gunplay, supported by auto-aim functionality. Throughout the main 9 levels of the game, there are a few other views as well, including top-down, or some fixed camera sections with sketchy platforming, and also a kinda cool throwback to the old base level view from the original. So a variety of perspectives is of course nothing new to the series, but this might be the most varied and somewhat experimental collection we'd see so far, for better or worse. As far as other mechanics go, you do have a life bar instead of dying in one hit, and you can carry up to 3 different weapons and switch between them at will. Weirdly, picking up a 4th weapon is kind of a crapshoot, as it's a bit hard to realize which weapon you'll be replacing. The machine gun, laser, spread, and crusher missiles are still here, along with a grenade launcher and this weird shrapnel gun thing which just sprays metal chunk things all over the place. Smart bombs can also be collected as well. And the stages move along pretty briskly, with numerous mini-bosses and large-scale action set pieces breaking up the adventure pretty well. And despite the free-form 3D stages, you probably won't have to take a lot of time exploring the level, although you often have to blow up various switches to open up new areas, and sometimes they can be a little tricky to track down. You'll surely recognize a few remakes of previous bosses from older games, and plenty of new surprises as well. And one of the more unique new moments is this anti-gravity battle, with a control scheme reminiscent of the Asteroids arcade game as you drift around a chamber in ball form while blasting away bad guys. Overall, this game feels a little more polished than Legacy of War, and the graphics are solid for the time period, the music's pretty good, voice samples are some knockoff Duke Nukem cringe, and it controls surprisingly okay considering the variety of gameplay modes. While this one has been generally reviewed a bit more harshly than Legacy of War was, I honestly had more fun getting through this one. The difficulty is a lot more balanced and reasonable as well. It does have a truncated easy mode again, along with normal and hard modes, and memory card functions like before, but it's generally not as punishing. Surprisingly, I also found the 2D stages to be some of the most bland moments of the game. It almost feels like they may have been shoehorned in just to appease some of the complaints from the previous game. And maybe to be able to use the screenshots to lure the old fans back to the series. I can't deny that both of these PS1 titles were still a pretty low point in the franchise overall, but I wouldn't disregard them entirely. If anything, they were ambitious and tried to go in some interesting directions, but the developers probably didn't exactly have the resources to properly execute on their ideas. It's a good example of how the Contra logo on the title screen certainly brings certain expectations of what the game should be, but in hindsight, maybe Appaloosa was dreaming of what it could be. Or maybe they were just getting paid. But either way, I'd still suggest checking these out with an open mind, maybe plop in a cheat code or two, and embrace the jank a little bit. Konami would take development duties back in-house with Contra's first appearance on the PlayStation 2 with Contra Shattered Soldier, released in 2002. Nobuya Nakazato would handle the game's direction after his work on Contra 3 and Contra Hardcore, disregarding the PS1 game's experimental 3D mechanics and story, and placing this in the timeline as a direct sequel to Contra Hardcore and restoring its two-dimensional roots with more modern-looking graphics. The plot gets pretty interesting with this one, where Bill Reiser has been blamed for massive losses of life after the Alien Wars, including being accused of the murder of Lance Bean, but is released from a cryogenic prison to handle the terrorist group Blood Falcon with the aid of Lucia, a playable and functionally identical cyborg soldier. Cutscenes throughout the gameplay uncover all sorts of intrigue and twists in the story, which even changes slightly depending on your gameplay performance, and leads to a variety of possible endings. As mentioned, the gameplay returns to the classic one-hit kill side-scroller style. There's a considerable focus on boss fights here, where any actual running and gunning is often broken up with wild assortments of encounters with massive machines or disgusting monsters, and even some fresh twists on familiar foes. A new weapon system would be introduced here, where Bill and Lucia can switch between 3 different weapons at any time with no need for collecting power-ups. Each of the guns, a machine gun, flamethrower, and grenade launcher, also has a unique charge-up shot attack, so you end up with a pretty decent array of tactics at your disposal to adapt to whatever situation is at hand, and you'll never be downgraded to a weaker weapon loadout if you die. A hit rate mechanic would also be added here, tracked and measured on screen as the percentage increases with the more enemies and objects you destroy, and it decreases as you lose lives or use continues. You get ranked at the end of each stage, and it's this score, along with your selected difficulty level, that can affect how far into the game you can get and ultimately see the true final ending. The game has 7 levels in total, with you being able to select from the first 4 and play through in any order, and training modes unlocked for stages as you complete them. You can also unlock options for increasing your lives and continues the more you play, arming you with enough resources to practice the game's patterns, and eventually rank high enough to access the rather abstract and sometimes psychedelic final levels of the game. The most hardcore soldiers out there might be able to pull off a perfect S rank on every stage and get to see a secret and absolutely ridiculous ending as well. So there's a lot of replayability in this one if you're looking for a true challenge. Thoughts on the overall presentation on this game have been a bit mixed. While the overall design and kinetic energy is very much the essence of Contra, with over-the-top action sequences and some absolutely wild boss fights, the aesthetic is usually a bit more dark and gritty than usual, with mostly drab and muted color schemes and 3D rendered objects instead of pixel art. It's certainly a product of its time in the early 2000s, but I think it might have benefited from a more colorful and vibrant take on the art style. Sound design is overall pretty great, albeit in a different direction than past games, but it does have a very energetic soundtrack by Akira Yamaoka and Sota Fujimori, blending thrash metal, breakbeats, and techno into a sonic frenzy that really adds to the vibe and hectic action of the game. Overall, it was great to see this entry in the series get back to the core of what makes Contra great, while also introducing some new ideas. And I'd argue this one went under the radar for a lot of people at the time, either from them disregarding the series after the PS1 mishaps, or perhaps also due to 2D action games not really being top sellers in the early 2000s. And I'd say if you had to pick one Contra game from the last 25 years to reevaluate today, it's gotta be this one. It's full of very memorable moments, and packed with satisfying challenges if you can push yourself to its conclusion. Contra would receive another game on the PS2 in 2004 with Neo Contra, developed in-house once again by Konami with their team Neo Kijirushi, albeit taking a different direction in gameplay for Contra's 10th game in the series. Bill would be pulled out of cryosleep once again to handle another menace to planet Earth, this time being woken up in the year 4444 to deal with a few renegade Neo Contra warriors. But once again, the plot unravels and twists in other unhinged ways, giving this installment one of the most bonkers storylines of the franchise that I don't even want to spoil, alongside with an overall jacked up level of absurdity in its characters and set pieces. While it does retain some elements from Shattered Soldier, like the lack of weapon pickups, hit rate mechanics, and level structures, the actual gameplay goes for a mostly isometric view, not that far removed from Legacy of War. Aside from the typical top-down shooter controls, one of your weapons can also home in on specific higher elevation targets, and you would also get dash and dodge maneuvers for avoiding hazards. There's also more variety in your weapons, as you can unlock more loadouts as you progress through the game, not to mention the other playable character Jaguar's katana-based attacks. The game also does throw in moments of different perspectives depending on the situation, for a decent variety of gameplay here. And while at the time Neo Contra was a bit criticized for detouring away from side-scrolling, the controls and camera work really well, and everything feels much better executed than its PS1 predecessors. The continuation of the hit rate ranking system returns, but feels a bit more lenient compared to Shattered Soldier, with reduced penalties for dying and only needing 98% for S rank. And in general, the difficulty seems more reasonable for anyone looking to get the true ending, especially once you unlock the weapon loadout with Heaven's Laser, an absolutely OP sub-weapon that honestly kinda breaks the game. But with 7 different loadouts available, some of the more esoteric guns can prove to add some extra challenge if you seek such a thing. The overall presentation fits pretty well into the series and feels a bit more lively and fun compared to Shattered Soldier, albeit arguably reaching peak levels of absurdity in the franchise. We'd be treated to fully voiced cutscenes in this one, giving some more character to this cast of ridiculous Contra warriors, like the Gorilla Contra, Plant Contra, Pheromone Contra, and Animal Contra.
Trap?
Indeed! This ship is about to self-destruct. You will die, a moth drawn to my flames.
The soundtrack's great, the graphics are very well done, and everything feels tightly designed and very well fleshed out. Yet despite all of this, reception to this one has been pretty mixed since its release. Admittedly, I kind of discarded this game when it first came out, with disappointment for the switch to isometric gameplay, but honestly, replaying it again recently was an absolute blast. And maybe it doesn't have much competition, but for me it's easily the best 3D-centric Contra game of the series. In commemoration of the 20-year anniversary of the Contra franchise, 2007 saw the release of Contra 4 on the Nintendo DS. Konami would hire out another developer this time around, putting WayForward in charge of crafting this somewhat nostalgic homage, taking Contra back to its roots with an experience more akin to the 8 and 16-bit games, but on the dual-screen handheld. And it was the first new and original portable Contra game since Operation C on the Game Boy. The game's events take place 2 years after Contra 3 and the defeat of Red Falcon, but now Black Viper has returned, and it's up to Bill and Lance and Mad Dog and Scorpion to stop it. Yep, to further confuse the Contra timeline, they are all separate individuals now, and these 4 are selectable from the start, with a handful of other unlockable characters as well, including Sheena, Probotector, Lucia, or even Jimbo and Sully. All of them are functionally identical, but a nice throwback to the previous games. Gameplay mostly takes the form of 2D side-scrolling action, with the biggest differentiator from most of the classic games being the full use of both screens of the DS, giving this game a similar layout to the vertically oriented arcade games. To accommodate for this, you're given a grappling hook, which can fire directly upwards and pull you up to various ledges when needed. Otherwise, the controls are pretty standard, jumping, shooting, and you can lock your stance to aim, and switch between 2 different guns much like Contra 3. Similar to the arcade Super Contra, you can upgrade a gun by obtaining the same power-up once more. Your standard gun and a lot of the other guns do not have rapid fire, so for better or worse, there is a return to button mashing here. Weapon power-ups include the familiar machine gun, laser, spread shot, fireball, homing, and crusher missiles. Aside from the side-scrolling stages, we'd also see a return of the behind-the-back perspective of the original base stages, utilizing some neat 3D effects, and putting a generally useless map onto the second screen. Again, this is a cool throwback, which is a recurring vibe through the game's 9 stages, as we get lots of references and fresh takes on locations like the waterfall or new evolutions of old bosses. Content-wise, there are multiple difficulty settings, and they would introduce a challenge mode, which lets you take on various short missions with unique requirements. There are also plenty of unlockable characters and other goodies, even including emulated versions of the NES Contra and Super C, which honestly don't perform so hot, but it's kinda neat anyway. Overall, it's pretty clear that WayForward put a lot of care into this one, and it really feels like a loving tribute to the golden age of Contra games, with a great soundtrack remixing a lot of the classic themes, and very vibrant and detailed pixel art. It's definitely a challenging game as well. Even the game's normal mode will put serious Contra players through their ringer, although there are moments when it's easy to blame the gap between the 2 screens for obscuring incoming bullets or enemies, and you'll have to train your eyes to keep more aware of the entire play area. Button mashing on the handheld DS can also get a bit tiresome, so really my main gripes with this game are mostly due to the hardware quirks. And I've always thought it would be cool to get a remade version of this game without the screen gap and on a more TV-friendly platform. Notably, there were several mobile versions of this game on various phone operating systems, even seeing a Contra 4 Redux being made with an all-new final boss, and in some cases the ability to play in horizontal or vertical mode depending on how you flip your phone screen.
What is this place?
Contra would also get the Rebirth treatment in 2009 with an installment in Konami's series of WiiWare exclusives, reimagining some of their classic franchises, which also included Castlevania and Gradius. Developed by M2, who had become well known for handling emulations of re-released retro games, this one also plays like a love letter to the 80s and 90s titles, focused on over-the-top 2D run-and-gun action. Plot-wise, it decides to go off on a completely alternate timeline, set in the year 2633 at the same time the original Contra took place, but with the antagonist Neo Salamander organization attempting to travel back in time to 1973 to kill Contras of the past, Terminator style. And Bill Reiser would also be sent back in time to rescue Lance, who had gone missing on a mission to avert this. Other characters include Genbei Yagyu, aka Jaguar from Neo Contra, along with an unlockable android girl version of Brownie, and the lizard man, Newt Pliskin. Some characters do have some slight attribute differences in speed and jump height, giving some minor differences in gameplay tactics during your playthroughs. The weaponry in this one is a bit limited, even though you can switch between two weapons here. The only available power-ups are the spread shot, laser, and homing missiles. The game is also a bit short, with 5 stages and a final boss stage, which isn't too surprising for a WiiWare downloadable only title, but the levels are at least chock full of action, with an intensity not far off of the frantically paced 16-bit Contra games. And the absurdity is amplified here, with memorable moments like the robot camel train, or riding on top of hordes of hard-shelled alien critters, not to mention some bizarre dialogue during its still image cutscenes. Overall, it does have a bit of a budget game feel, with some kind of cartoony looking art and truncated feeling content, but it still plays very well, has a really great soundtrack, and should appeal to anyone looking for a classic Contra experience. Difficulty-wise, easy and normal modes are very reasonable to get through, and true masochists can try out the game's Nightmare mode, which still grants unlimited continues, but serves up Kaizo-like levels of challenge, making some sections feel more like an insane action puzzle experience to figure out how to survive the onslaught of enemies and bullets in your path. Unfortunately, there's no way to purchase this game anymore thanks to the closure of the Wii Shop channel in 2019, but we're all crossing our fingers someday for Konami's re-release of these unique Rebirth titles. And in what might be the most obscure game in our list today, 2009 also saw the release of Contra: The War of the Worlds, released in China for Java-based cell phones. I should mention this wouldn't be the first time Contra appeared in Java form, with numerous ports of the original games floating around on that platform, some official and some certainly not, and many of which have been completely lost to time. But in this case, we would get a new and actually original Contra game that was legally published by Konami. Now, the only version I could get running was a Russian translation, so I'm honestly not sure what's going on story-wise, but it does have 4 side-scrolling stages and the typical run-and-gun action you would expect, but just with a pretty rough frame rate and added life bar. Despite this, the game is actually half decent considering the circumstances, with some unique levels and enemies, and including a very interesting mechanic in the second stage where gravity is periodically altered. If you can get a Java emulator up and running and remap those phone keys to a gamepad, this one's definitely worth a look for a franchise completionist. The following year would see yet another Contra game hit mobile platforms with Contra Evolution, first releasing in China in 2010 and eventually becoming an arcade game in 2011, and finally ported worldwide to Android and iOS platforms in 2013. It's essentially a remake of the original NES Contra, but with a questionable facelift, replacing the pixel art with a low-rent asset store HD look. But otherwise, the gameplay is very similar, with some slight differences in challenge here and there, and a choice to play as Bill, Lance, or the newcomers Erica and Sally, who also have some different weapon pickups available. The arcade version seen here also includes a ranking system to grade your performance after each stage, but that's just more for bragging rights than anything else. The mobile versions would toss in a boss rush mode, elite mode with stronger enemies, and a mission mode mainly for grinding out medals to purchase unlockables, which of course could also be bought with real money via microtransactions. I spent more time with the arcade version than the mobile ones, since I'm not much of a fan of touchscreen controls for this kind of game, and while it's visually very cheap looking, it's pretty tough to mess up the gameplay of the original Contra, and that's basically intact here, throwing in at least a couple curveballs here and there to keep veteran players on their toes. I will say the mobile version of this game has been delisted for a while, presumably to make room for Konami's current mobile game offering, Contra Returns, released in China in 2017 and eventually seen a worldwide release in 2021. Developed by a subsidiary of Tencent Games, it warps the Contra formula into a free-to-play MMORPG monstrosity, loaded with microtransactions at every turn, shoehorned crossovers with other franchises like the Terminator, and long gacha grind collectibles and items. I don't have much more to say about this one, as it honestly hurts my 8-bit heart to see Contra in this kind of form. But arguably, it probably must be appealing to someone out there, considering the revenue it's likely bringing in. So maybe one might have some fun with it if they need a quick Contra fix on their cell phone.
The other side of Galuga.
Now let's get back to a good one now, with a Contra game without the name, Hardcore Uprising, released in 2011 for the Xbox 360 and PS3. Developed by Arc System Works, who at the time was most well known for creating the Guilty Gear fighting game series, their take on the Contra franchise would act as a prequel to Contra Hardcore, while taking things into a different artistic direction, going for an anime-infused aesthetic while also building a bit further upon the typical gameplay mechanics and systems. Story-wise, the game takes place in 2613, 20 years prior to the events of the first Contra, where an elite group of resistance fighters are rebelling against the reign of Emperor Tiberius. The main base characters include Bahamut, an indirect reference to Colonel Bahamut, and Crystal, a faster female character. Other playable characters are available through individual DLC purchases, each with their own differences in story progression, health, speed, and weaponry, with the most notable outlier being the very powerful Sayuri, with a focus on sword melee combat that completely changes up the gameplay approach. While it is a bit annoying to have to purchase the extra content here, I'd say the extra characters are worth it in this case, as they add a really nice amount of replayability, as you have to approach situations much differently depending on who you're playing as. Gameplay options consist of two different modes, Arcade Mode and Rising Mode, with Arcade Mode being a more traditional experience of progressing through the game's 8 levels, starting out with a limited number of continues, but gradually unlocking more with more gameplay time. Rising Mode plays differently, in that currency acquired in levels will let you purchase various upgrades and essentially level up your character in a wide variety of ways, from new maneuvers, more health, more lives, and plenty more. It feels like a bit more of an RPG-light grind at times, but it does make the game more approachable, and it's a great way to improve your skills before potential attempts at the more unforgiving arcade mode. Now getting into the actual gameplay, Hardcore Uprising follows in the footsteps of Contra Hardcore by sticking to pure 2D side-scrolling. Most characters have health bars, also akin to the Japanese version of Contra Hardcore, but weapon storage would use the tried and true Contra 3 approach, with 2 weapon slots that can be changed at will, and various weapon pickup capsules that will appear throughout the stages, and with upgrades available if you can grab the same power-up again. Weapons include the standard rifle, a machine gun, chain laser, grenade launcher, heat gun with a chargeable fireball, the spread shot, and a unique ripple gun, which offers up some defensive tactics. Another very big change to the controls here would be in your movement, with the ability to run much faster after double tapping a direction, a double jump, a parry counter, and a mid-air dash, with all these skills making this easily one of the more complex movesets so far in the series. It takes a while to rein in all these abilities and use them effectively, but it does make the game feel really agile and dynamic once you get a handle on it. Getting into the levels, there's quite a lot of variety and scenery in the game's 8 stages, each also feeling pretty lengthy with plenty of mid-bosses and various action set pieces to keep things moving along, and it supplies a healthy amount of content considering it was a download exclusive Contra game, and especially so if you were to put this side by side with the 5 short stages of Contra Rebirth. I guess one downside here is that finishing a full run of this game can be a bit grueling, as the last few stages ramp up the difficulty rather drastically, especially considering having what I consider to be the most difficult final boss sequence of the entire series. Other than that, my only other minor complaints are some pretty rough sound effects, with some kinda nasty sounding distorted yelling and bad audio balancing on the Xbox 360 version. And it's also a little bit disappointing to be typically battling against humans and giant robots as opposed to gross aliens and stuff. There are a couple monstrous moments here and there, and really that's just a personal preference that doesn't affect how great of a running gun that this remains to be. The mechanics and level designs are all very well crafted and thoughtful, with plenty of that over-the-top Contra action we come to expect. And the level of challenge is hugely customizable depending on your taste, and if you don't mind the new anime look to everything, it's a really great looking game, despite being a departure from the usual. Overall, I'd highly recommend giving this one a go for a fresh take on the series, but just be ready for some suffering once you finally face off with Tiberius. And now for one of the more controversial directions the series has gone in, it's time to discuss the maligned and critically reviled Contra Rogue Core, released in 2019 for PC and other modern console platforms, and being the first new Contra game with a physical release since Contra 4. Nobuya Nakazato would return after his work on the masterpieces Contra 3, Contra Hardcore, and Shattered Soldier to oversee development on this one, claiming a desire to capture the traditional spirit of the Contra series while modernizing it for a new audience. To me, this sounds more like a meaningless blurb churned out by a marketing team, but let's dig more into this one and give it a fair shot here, as I actually gave this game a pretty thorough playthrough recently, despite a lot of initial disappointment when the first game released. Rogue Core takes place 2 years after the end of the Alien Wars in a post-apocalyptic cityscape called the Damned City, overrun with fiends, and it's up to this ragtag group of super soldier Jaegers to deal with them, including Kaiser, a cracked-out Bill Riser-like with a drill for an arm, Miss Harakiri, a sword-wielding assassin with an alien for a stomach, the Gentleman, a well-mannered and intelligent alien bug thing, and Hungry Beast, a cyborg panda.
Hungry Beast! I love him so much.
From the cast of characters alone, the overall tone is a weird mix of goofy and edgy, and you do get a little bit more atmosphere and lore from some occasional comic book art style still image cutscenes, which feel a little cheap, but it at least gives a little more substance. The core gameplay concept is where things get real divisive. It's mostly an isometric twin-stick shooter, not far removed from Neo Contra, with some brief perspective switches to top-down or a behind-the-back shooting gallery kind of view. You've got a main weapon and a sub-weapon, both with unlimited ammo, but each gun also has a heat meter that must be managed. Once a gun overheats, there is a cooldown period where you must either wait or switch to your other weapon. A mechanic completely new to the franchise and noticeably drags down the pacing of combat right from the start. For better or worse, putting a stronger focus on resourceful tactics, movement, crowd control, and damage optimization. Each character also has a special ability on a cooldown, occasional time duration classic style power-ups such as the spread shot, and there are also collectible bombs which you can use to drop massive damage onto the screen. Rogue Core would also introduce RPG looter shooter elements, as you level up your characters and gather all sorts of currency, resources, item schematics, and even body parts, which you can then use to augment your stats and weapon loadouts back at home base. Now, this is a genre I can certainly get into, as I've logged more hours in games like Diablo and Borderlands than I care to admit. But again, it's kind of a surprising turn for the Contra franchise that really wasn't received well, and again makes the game start at a somewhat glacial pace as you soon realize the grind that you're in for in a lengthy campaign ahead. The gameplay is split up into a long list of missions which can be selected, which include about 40 missions divided into 7 difficulty ranks, each with a big boss fight at the end, along with a handful of longer exploration missions and some more challenging hardcore missions. This might seem like no shortage of content, especially since the missions can be pretty long, but many of the locations, enemy types, and mini-bosses are heavily recycled and reused often. Now, at least in my experience, I did not have to repeat very many missions as far as grinding out experience and items goes, unless I happen to have died on a difficult boss or something. But the repetition of very similar levels and battles makes it feel like a bit of a slog. And if you aim for higher ranks for each mission, obviously it gets more so, but going for that is optional. Now, there is a very wide array of weapon types you can collect and optimize with various modifications, along with some weird gambling mechanics added onto the body part customization by paying more in-game currency for the potential of a better eyeball or heart installation. But the general progression feels a bit unsatisfying and often confusing. Your characters never really change appearance based on your gear, and you can't even really look at the gear at all. It's all just simple icons and poorly explained attributes. And while I do love seeing numbers go up in this kind of game, it's just not usually very exciting here. But I should at least give this game a bit of credit for a vast selection of weird weapons to collect and build upon, ranging from the classic machine guns and lasers to more bizarre choices like razor hula hoops and rocket fists. Gameplay aside, the presentation feels dated for a game released in 2019 by an established publisher. Obviously, I don't mind the retro aesthetic, but the look and style here feels almost like a muddy-looking PS2 game. Not to mention there are rather noticeable performance issues on the 2 versions I played. Rogue Core also supports a range of multiplayer options, with online co-op and PvP modes, which is honestly a side of the game I did not experience yet, and with the right group, I have to assume this could be more fun. But good luck finding anyone willing to play this one with you, when there are certainly better examples of the genre out there currently. And on the DLC tip, there surprisingly wasn't a huge focus on selling you microtransactions, compared to the previously mentioned Contra mobile games. But there is a Season Pass, which gives you a bit of in-game cash, items, and character skins. And it might be worth the extra couple of bucks if you can get the pass along with the game whenever both of them go on frequent deep discounts on Steam or wherever else. The extra currency really helps the initial grind be more tolerable. Now overall, the experience here is weird. I think I already stated most of my gripes, but the game does redeem itself at times, with some true moments of actual good old Contra radness hiding in there, especially in a few of the bigger boss battles. I especially like the multiple run-ins with Big Fuzz and this pretty insane subway fight. It's just kind of a bummer that these moments are sandwiched between hours of rehashed missions and areas. And if you're not up for a little loot grind, you may want to steer very clear of this one. I'm reminded a bit of Contra Force on the NES in some ways, where there's some cool ideas, but they're buried deeply underneath various gameplay issues, poor performance, and the high expectations that I have for a game bearing the Contra logo. I will say after actually sinking some considerable time into this one, about 20 hours to get through the 7 ranks of standard missions and a pretty wild final boss, I certainly don't think it deserved a lot of the worst game of the year claims thrown out at the time of its release, and I'm surprisingly glad to have reevaluated it more deeply now, with an open mind and broader perspective on the varied directions the Contra series has taken as a whole. Basically, it's not for everyone, but it's not the hot garbage I thought it was after my first plays.
Time to introduce ourselves.
Hell yeah, brother.
And finally, we come to the most recent game in the franchise, released in the spring of 2024 on PC and modern consoles. It's Contra Operation Galuga, developed by WayForward, who were brought back after their work on Contra 4, and they even retained some of the same dev team. Rather than going for a fresh new canonical entry or trying more questionable genre experimentation, Operation Galuga is more of a remake or reimagining of the original Contra, taking place in the year 26XX in the same location as the first game, the Galuga Archipelago, with good old Bill and Lance versus the Red Falcon, and with good old 2D side-scrolling action. But obviously with all sorts of other familiar characters, enemies, and game mechanics popping up from other games in the series, along with introducing some new elements as well.
Who's next?
In what is probably the most notable change in play controls is free aiming, by using the analog stick to shoot in any direction, although there is still an option to go back to 8-way shooting in case you want a bit of throwback and added challenge. Weapons are grabbed via power-ups with 2 slots to switch from at any time, and also upgradable with consecutive pickups, and the arsenal includes returns of the machine gun, spread shot, laser, homing, crusher missiles, and flame weapon. Different playable characters that you can unlock throughout the course of the game also have slight variations on each of these loadouts. Mobility also includes some variety between characters, with some folks having double jumps, air dashes, slides, grappling hooks, or even jetpacks. Game modes include a story mode, which supports up to 2 players and includes some basic cutscenes and dialogue during the experience, and a more streamlined arcade mode, which supports up to 4 players simultaneously, and a challenge mode similar to what we got in Contra 4, with all sorts of short 1 to 2 minute mini missions with various completion requirements. There are also plenty of difficulty options with easy, normal, and hard modes for each, along with turning the health bar on or off in case you want the classic one-hit kill experience. Playing through any of the modes will also very slowly accumulate in-game currency, which can be used in the perk shop, where you can unlock more additional characters like our friends from Contra Hardcore like Brownie, Sheena, Brad Fang, or additional perks for each character, or general ones like extra lives and health, or alternate soundtracks like mixes of old Konami classics or modern remixes of recognizable Contra tunes. It remains to be seen if more things will be added to this shop over time or not, but I will say again, it takes a while to buy all of this stuff. Even after several hours and multiple playthroughs leading up to an arcade mode 1cc, I've personally only unlocked a few characters and soundtracks and have a long way to go to get everything else. Getting into the meat of the game here, there are 8 levels total, all with some recognizable throwbacks to Contra locations, enemies, and bosses from previous games, and fans of the series might appreciate all the references strewn about here. You got jungles, bases, waterfalls, ruins, labs, and of course an alien lair, and plenty of old favorite bosses making comebacks here and there with new twists in their behavior. That being said, the stages are also pretty lengthy, but sometimes feel a bit padded and drag on a bit, especially in some of the auto-scrolling stages. You'd think riding a jet bike would be exciting as hell, but the base and train stages here get rather tedious. And I found a feeling of emptiness in the game's overall aesthetic as well. While there isn't anything really egregious here, it just comes off as aggressively bland and very safe, with a rendered look closer to the recent Contra mobile games as opposed to classic pixel art, which WayForward nailed so well in Contra 4, and a very generic default orchestral soundtrack reinforces this stale feeling, with nothing very memorable there, and I found myself quickly scrambling to purchase classic soundtracks from the perk shop. But even those really great chiptunes don't gel very well with the game in most cases. I guess the whole vibe of Galuga came off to me as seemingly attempting to reach a newer audience who may be fresh to the genre or series, while also trying to cater to the old Contra heads with a return to old mechanics and throwbacks. And not that there's anything wrong with trying to make a game more accessible, but here it feels pretty undercooked. It sits squarely in B-rank territory, almost feeling like concessions and compromises were being made with release date and revenue in mind, instead of more polish and just making the game more fun. To be fair, these thoughts are coming from myself fresh off of 2 months of playing through every game in the series, so naturally Galuga was under a pretty strict microscope, coupled with a mild bit of burnout after having just spent 20 hours on Rogue Core. So take my words with a little grain of salt. A fresher perspective or less experience with the series might make this one more enjoyable, and I don't want to dissuade anyone from giving it a shot sometime, especially if they drop the price a bit, with the $40 initial price tag feeling a bit on the high end, especially considering the numerous hours that you'll need to sink into this if you want to unlock all of the perk shop content.
You miss me, baby?
It also remains to be seen if Konami and WayForward will continue working on the game beyond any basic bug fixes. Perhaps down the road some additional content or balancing could see some improvements coming overall. Branching out of the series briefly here, recent years have seen a handful of indie games heavily inspired by Contra, some of which nail that classic vibe and gameplay even better than Konami's recent efforts. There are quite a few floating around out there, which may be a topic worth exploring deeper in another video someday, but here's a quick list to get you started. Super Cyborg is a 2015 title with a game feel very similar to the 8-bit days, but with some great unhinged boss designs and absolutely brutal difficulty. And more recently, we have Huntdown, a 2020 run-and-gun gem with some great B-movie flavored vibes. And also definitely check out Valfaris with a gory sci-fi heavy metal atmosphere. And Blazing Chrome from 2019 is probably one of the more blatantly obvious Contra-inspired titles of late, but they really nailed the aesthetic and style of the 16-bit games. And I'd say it's a must-play for fans of the earlier entries in the Contra series. And we surely shouldn't forget Cuphead, obviously with a much different art style and setting, but undoubtedly having that Contra mentality in its core gameplay and notorious difficulty. And while Operation Galuga might be the most recent mainline Contra game at the time of making this video, one thing I did not have on my bingo card this year was official Contra downloadable content being added onto Vampire Survivors, an indie roguelike game that first released in obscurity at the end of 2021, but eventually went viral and found great success in sales and award achievements. The developers continuously supported and improved the game with engine optimizations and more content, which now includes this Contra DLC in collaboration with Konami, Operation Guns, which released on May 9th, 2024, and adds all sorts of new Contra-themed stages, characters, background music, some familiar bosses, and of course devastating weaponry. Now, unless we're gonna count some of the old top-down stages in games like Super C, the gameplay here isn't really going to scratch that pure Contra itch, but regardless, if you already like this game or others in the same style, you might have some fun mowing down hordes of enemies with all the eye-melting guns that you can upgrade. And of course, you can't go wrong with throwing in some classic Contra tunes in the background, direct from titles like Contra 4 or Contra Hardcore. And much like the base game, the DLC is very reasonably priced, and there are easily several hours to be spent here if you're trying to unlock everything. Also, this wouldn't be the first time Konami has had one of their franchises cross over with indie games, with Castlevania popping up in Dead Cells and V Rising, so I have to wonder if Contra will also start making appearances elsewhere. And one final recent Contra-related release to mention is on the unofficial tip, a fan-made port of the original Famicom Contra to the Super Nintendo, by a developer that goes by the name Infidelity, who has also converted a few other NES titles to the Super Nintendo, often with the goal of eliminating slowdown and sprite flicker thanks to the more powerful hardware. Contra would get this treatment along with the addition of weapon switching a la Contra 3, along with the ability to strafe and lock your stance while shooting, which can certainly change up potential strategies for clearing the game. Also notably, the conversion includes MSU1 capabilities, offering up alternate soundtracks with choices between the original Famicom and arcade game music, metal and electronic covers of Contra themes, or even a cinematic soundtrack with orchestral scores ripped straight out of relevant action movies, and a new opening cutscene which surely will look familiar as well.
You son of a bitch.
While I probably prefer the OG authentic experience, and I've never considered the Famicom port to be struggling in terms of performance, this is still a very cool technical achievement and fun novelty, and the added control options or simply the convenience of playing this on your Super Nintendo might appeal to some players. And that wraps up our retrospective here, and I gotta say it's been a true pleasure exploring one of my favorite game franchises so deeply over the last few months. And it was a great experience being able to reevaluate some titles I'd never beaten before or just previously disregarded in the past, and gain a better perspective for all the twists and turns the series has taken. If you're curious, I've posted some of the full live playthroughs and 1cc runs on a second channel linked in the description, or also check out another video on the way where I personally rank every Contra game and port that we checked out. And as we blast our way into 2026, let's addendum aggressively. So while I was recompiling this video, I wanted to add a few new things to our glorious Contra pile, with some stuff I either wasn't aware of at all, or even some new releases or recently preserved games since the first two videos were made. First up, a new Contra arcade game would see a release in 2025, and Konami even named it after me. What an honor. Contra Burst is a rail shooter redemption game that you might be able to find in Round 1 arcades across the US. So I took a little drive to Ohio to record a full playthrough. The cabinet's pretty cool, with two big screens, one for shooting stuff and one for reading stuff, and of course 2 beautiful mounted gun turrets. And apparently this was a conversion kit for Bomberman the Metal. And this reuses a lot of art and assets from Operation Galuga. You basically just blast hordes of enemies in the hopes of earning enough points to move on to the next stage. There are also some bonus level boss fights that require a little bit of strategy to either take out various body parts fast enough or to utilize powerful bomb attacks at the right moment. Or often you might just need to swipe away more of your money to get more items. You do at least earn tickets for your performance, but otherwise it's a fairly short and mindless experience. If you're in the mood for that, it's just fine, but just don't expect much substance here. And on the redemption game tip, I didn't really mention the more derided side of Konami gaming with their casino-focused output. The Contra franchise would be no exception, with Contra 3D released in Japan in 2013, and 3 different Neo-Contra slot machines in the years following, including an American release of Neo-Contra Samurai Strike. Now, I haven't played these myself, but there are some gameplay videos floating around YouTube if you're curious. The mid-2000s would also see a handful of Contra ports to mobile brick phones of the era, with some Java-based versions either attempting to recreate the arcade or NES experiences. I did gloss over these in the first retrospective, but I wanted to briefly showcase some of the few official ones that have been preserved in some form. Konami released a few different variants of the original Contra in its arcade or NES forms. It's a mixed bag here, with some versions being devoid of sound or trimming down the number of stages drastically. Controlling Contra with a phone keypad is as cumbersome as you might imagine, but at least they usually have some automatic rapid fire, so you'll mainly be focusing on your movement and deciphering the crude graphics. Again, these are a pretty cool novelty for anyone wanting to dig deep into obscure ports to see how things have been scaled down. Super Contra would see similar ports with a port closer to the arcade experience, or another demake of the NES version, which was weirdly titled Super Contra 2. I will say the arcade-like version is actually pretty good compared to the OG Contra Java games, and it doesn't cut any levels. And it even manages to include a couple of stages and the final boss from the NES version, Super C, which is tacked onto the end. Now, I couldn't find anything official that ported Contra 3, but Contra Hardcore did get a Java port, and it's brutally difficult, retaining the one-hit deaths and not really making many adjustments to the frantic challenges presented in the Genesis game. Good luck with this one. Contra 4 would have a similar issue, where your controls and frame rate are severely hamstrung, but the game still feels pretty impossible. This would be somewhat fixed in Contra 4 Redux, later released for Android devices, so that's probably a more palatable experience. Last but not least, I didn't really show the Java version of Contra Evolution, which was that remake of Contra 1 that came out on Android and iOS and eventually arcades in China. This is definitely the most primitive of the bunch, feeling basically like a reskin of the previous crusty Contra K-Tai stuff. Also on the Android tip, I did uncover some other interesting things that are sadly delisted and maybe unplayable currently, but apparently the Star Wars Force Collection mobile game had a Contra minigame, which looks wild. And the mobile version of the roguelite run-and-gunner Neon Abyss Infinite also had a Contra DLC available for a short while. Speaking of delisted, that Contra Returns game that I mentioned previously is now dead, unfortunately. I kinda wish I'd given it more of a shot back when it was online, but who knows, maybe someday it will get the Castlevania Grimoire of Souls treatment and get a weird re-release with all of the gacha mechanics removed.
You got a new assault rifle.
And one other odd piece of Contra software released recently would be X8 Contra Super Wallstorm, a Contra-fied version of X8, a VR hero shooter game. I don't have a VR setup to try this out myself, but this might be of interest to anyone into the idea. And in the fan-made realm, I did want to mention a new project currently in beta by the same guy that made that Contra SNES hack. But this time he's taken on the task of fixing the notorious slowdown issues of Contra Force. This doesn't really change the feeling that this wasn't really a Contra game in the first place, but regardless, this may be a far improved way to play the game now that the lag has been removed. And it's definitely more difficult. That slowdown did help make some of the game easier. Now this isn't quite finalized yet at the time of making this video, and there are still some sections that experience slowdown, but this is definitely something to keep an eye on. And finally, to get really out into the fringes of Contra gaming, there was even a board game made pretty recently, a cooperative experience for 1 to 4 players with a modular deck system set within the Contra universe. It had a bit of a rocky production history, originally made by Blacklist Games as a crowdfunded project in 2022, but it's now currently distributed by Kess Entertainment and available at many major retailers. You basically pick a commando with Bill, Lance, Lucia, and even Sweets from Rogue Corps, each with their own special abilities and some unique action cards, and then take on the stage of your choice with enemies and bosses that can vary depending on the number of players in your game. The included board has a jungle side and an alien layer side, and as turns between players and enemies progress, the level cards will keep adding new enemies and hazards trying to kill you. Combat is handled with custom dice, with some of the sides doing damage, or other sides granting you advantage tokens, which are needed to avoid damage or other special events. You can also get gun power-ups or clear objectives to level up your character a bit. I won't get too deep into the rules and mechanics here, but there are a ton of tokens and various little decks of cards, which are a little overwhelming at first, but you might eventually get it figured out. I've yet to play this with an actual group, but solo play seemed crazy difficult to actually win, which I guess lines up with the difficulty of Contra video games in general. But of course, you could always modify the rules a bit to your liking to make things feel a little bit more fair. And all the artwork and stuff is pretty decent, and it seems like a lot of heart went into the details here. Honestly, it's a bit weird trying to translate the frantic run-and-gun action of Contra into a methodical, turn-based experience with a somewhat dense rule set, but this still might be of interest to some people out there. There also seems to be a reworked and updated version of this coming soon called Contra Reloaded, so I guess you should keep an eye out for that as well if it comes to fruition. And I think that's it for now, but with my luck, Konami will probably announce some new random Contra thing the day after I upload this. But who am I to complain for more Contra to talk about? Thank you so much for watching, and maybe even re-watching this retrospective series, and if you haven't already, check out my massive deep dive into the Castlevania franchise. And we'll catch you next time.